Captain Ethan Graves signed the death certificates with a steady hand. No hesitation, no pause. 3 Navy SEALs and 1 combat medic declared dead case closed, mission written off as an acceptable loss. He set down his pen, straightened his uniform, and walked out of that office like a man who had simply finished paperwork, not like a man who had just condemned 4 people still breathing somewhere in those mountains to die alone. Before we go any further, if this story hits you the way it hit me, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because what happened next will change the way you see courage forever. The day Captain Ethan Graves declared them dead, Ava Carter was still very much alive. She was crouched inside a narrow rock crevice somewhere in the eastern Afghan mountains, pressing her hands so hard against Marcus Hale's chest wound that her fingers had gone numb an hour ago. The blood had soaked through 2 field dressings, through her gloves, through the fabric of her uniform sleeve. It was still coming, not fast enough to be immediately fatal, but fast enough to matter, fast enough that she counted every minute like it was currency she was running out of. Marcus was conscious, barely. His lips were pale and cracked from dehydration, and every time he breathed there was a sound that no medic ever wants to hear, a wet sucking sound from deep inside a chest that had no business making that noise. "You still with me?" Ava asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Still here," Marcus said. His voice was thin, stretched, like paper held up to light. "Good, keep talking to me." "About what?" "Anything. Your wife, your dong, what you're going to eat when you get home." "I don't care, just keep talking." Marcus tried to smile. It came out wrong. "My wife makes this thing, red beans and rice. She makes it every Sunday. She's been making it since before we even got married." "Sounds incredible. Best thing I ever ate in my life." "You're going to eat it again." Marcus looked at her. His eyes, dark brown, bloodshot, exhausted, found her face and held on. "You really believe that?" Ava didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "I know that. Now keep talking." 12 feet away, Ryan Walker was propped against the stone wall of the crevice with his legs stretched out in front of him. Both legs. She had stabilized the worst of the fractures with improvised splints made from broken branches and strips cut from a spare uniform she'd been carrying in her pack. The pain had been bad enough when she set the bones that Ryan had bitten completely through his own lip, trying to keep from screaming. He hadn't made a sound, not a single sound. He just sat there afterward, breathing through his nose in slow, controlled bursts, his hands folded in his lap like a man sitting in a waiting room, and not like a man whose legs looked the way his did. Titan lay across Ryan's legs. The Belgian Malinois hadn't moved from that position in nearly 2 hours. His big amber eyes were scanning the entrance to the crevice, never still, never relaxed, but the warmth of his body against Ryan's shattered legs was the only heat source in that space, and Ryan's color was better because of it. Ava had noticed that. She hadn't said anything about it. She didn't need to. Titan knew what he was doing. Chief Daniel Brooks sat closest to the entrance, back straight despite the shrapnel still embedded in his left shoulder. She had extracted what she could without proper surgical tools. What remained was deep enough that pulling at it risked doing more damage than leaving it. She had packed the wound, dressed it, given him the last of her antibiotics from the field kit. He was running a fever, low grade, but climbing. Every hour it climbed was an hour closer to a problem she couldn't manage with what she had. Daniel was the quietest of the 3. He always had been. She was learning. He watched everything. He processed everything. And occasionally when he spoke, what he said carried enough weight to stop a room. He stopped her now with just her name. "Carter." She looked up from Marcus. "You've checked the radio 6 times in the last hour." "I know. It's not going to change." She looked at him steadily. "I know that too. So why do you keep checking?" Ava was quiet for a moment. Outside the crevice, the wind had picked up, carrying cold air down from the peaks above them. She could hear it moving through the rocks, high and thin and indifferent. "Because checking is something I can do," she finally said. "And I'm going to keep doing everything I can do." Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded exactly once and went back to watching the entrance. "Let me take you back to how they got here. 47 hours earlier, the mission had seemed almost routine by the standards of what these men did for a living. A reconnaissance operation into a section of the Kunar province that intelligence believed was being used as a transit corridor by a mid-level enemy network. The team was 4 operators strong: Walker Hale Brooks and 1 additional SEAL named Torres, who had been assigned last minute when the original 4th man came down with a knee injury the night before insertion. Ava had been attached as combat medic, a role she had performed on 11 previous operations over the past 2 years. Titan was her partner, had been her partner since before either of them had ever set foot on Afghan soil. She had trained with Titan for 18 months at Fort Bragg before their first deployment. In that time, she had come to understand something about the dog that she had a hard time explaining to people who hadn't worked with a Malinois before. Titan was not just an animal following commands. Titan was a colleague. He had preferences. He had moods. He communicated in ways that were subtle and inconsistent enough that she had learned to read them the way she read vital signs as information. As data as signals worth paying attention to. On the morning of the mission, during the final equipment check before they loaded onto the helicopter, Titan had been agitated. Not obviously. Not in a way that would have meant anything to someone who didn't know him. But Ava knew him. The way he kept circling back to her instead of ranging forward. The way his ears tracked sounds she couldn't hear. She had knelt beside him, run her hand along his back, felt the tension in his muscles. "What is it?" she had whispered. Titan had looked at her. His amber eyes were fully alert, scanning in directions she couldn't identify as specific threats. She had almost said something to the team leader. Almost, but she was the medic. She was not the one who called off missions. She didn't have intelligence to point to nothing concrete, nothing she could put into words that wouldn't sound like she was telling 4 Navy SEALs to stand down because her dog had a bad feeling. She climbed onto the helicopter. 17 minutes after insertion, everything fell apart. The first shot came from the ridge to the northeast, and it was followed almost immediately by fire from 3 additional positions, coordinated, rehearsed, professionally executed. This was not an opportunistic ambush. This was a prepared kill zone, the kind of positioning that required advanced knowledge of exactly where a team was going to be and exactly when they were going to bother him. Torres went down in the first 15 seconds. Ava reached him in under a minute, but the wound was catastrophic and there was nothing. Not a word she liked to use, not a word she used lightly. There was nothing to be done. She held his hand. She said his name. She was there with him until the moment he wasn't anymore. Then she was up and moving because the other 3 still had a chance. Ryan Walker had been hit trying to reach Torres, both legs. The rounds had caught him mid-stride and he went down hard, and the only reason he hadn't been hit again immediately was that Marcus Hale had thrown himself across open ground and dragged Ryan behind a boulder that was barely large enough to cover them both. Marcus had taken his wound doing that. Ava had treated them both in the middle of an active firefight, using her own body as partial cover, working fast the way she'd been trained, talking steadily the whole time, not comforting words, just practical words. "This is going to hurt. Breathe, hold still, I've got you." Daniel Brooks had kept them alive by laying down suppressing fire alone from a position that gave him almost no cover, taking the shrapnel hit in his shoulder during that process, and not telling anyone about it for 20 minutes. Because he needed his arm to keep functioning for as long as it would. By the time the immediate contact broke, the enemy pulling back, regrouping, not retreating, Ava had 5 living people in her care, including herself and Titan, and 1 man she could no longer help. She had made a decision in those moments that she didn't agonize over because agonizing wasn't a luxury the situation allowed. She made an assessment. She identified what was possible. She began working toward it. The radio call went out within the first hour. Position casualties request for immediate extraction. The response that came back was technically a response, a confirmation that the transmission had been received, but the extraction that should have followed didn't come. They waited. Ava used that time to move them. Not far. Far enough to not be where the enemy expected them to be, which was the most important thing. Titan ranged forward and came back, ranged forward and came back, each return telling her something about what was ahead through the direction he came from, the speed of his return, the set of his shoulders. She read him like a map. They found the crevice by the end of that first day. It wasn't ideal shelter. It was enough shelter. In her experience, enough was what you worked with. The second radio call went out that evening. Request for extraction update on casualties coordinates. Again, a technical confirmation. Again, no response that meant anything. "Maybe they're working on it," Marcus had said. He was running a temperature by then, and his color was bad, but his eyes were clear and his voice was steady, and Ava loved him a little bit for the faith he was trying to hold on to. Maybe, she had said. She didn't believe it. She had been in the field long enough to know what operational silence felt like when it was logistics versus when it was something else. This felt like something else. She couldn't prove it. She didn't say it out loud, but she began quietly, methodically to operate under the assumption that rescue was not coming the way it was supposed to come. She began planning for a different kind of rescue. Meanwhile, she had 3 men to keep alive through another night. Ryan Walker, for all the damage done to his legs, was proving to be almost unnaturally mentally tough. During the long, cold hours of the first night, when the temperature in the crevice dropped low enough that their breath was visible, he had started telling stories. Rambling, semi-coherent stories about missions and bar tabs and a dog he had had growing up named Bucket, who chased every car that came down his street for 7 years and never once caught one. Marcus would laugh weakly, and even Daniel would occasionally exhale through his nose in something that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. Titan would lift his head, look at whoever was speaking, then set his head back down. Ava had sat in those hours and listened to those stories and kept her hands busy rationing supplies, reassessing wounds, running through mental calculations of distance and terrain and the physical reality of what it would take to move 3 men out of mountains on foot, and she had felt something settle inside her. Not peace exactly, something more like clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a situation strips away everything that doesn't matter and leaves only what does. What mattered was this: those 3 men were breathing. As long as they were breathing, she had a job to do. The 3rd radio call went out on the morning of the 2nd day. She made the call herself using Ryan's radio because hers had taken damage during the firefight. She identified herself clearly. She gave their position. She gave a status update on each casualty. She gave the time and asked for confirmation of extraction timeline. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she thought the transmission hadn't gone through. Then a voice came back, not command, not operations, a voice she didn't recognize, acknowledging receipt of transmission and advising that the situation was, quote, under assessment. Under assessment. Ryan was watching her face when she lowered the radio. He had heard the response. His jaws tightened. Under assessment, he repeated. His voice was very quiet, very controlled. Yeah, that's what they said. That's what they said. The silence between them had weight to it, the kind of weight that comes with understanding something you wish you didn't understand. Carter, Ryan said slowly. Don't. I'm just going to say, Ryan. Her voice was firm but not hard. I hear you, but don't. Not yet. We have work to do. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, the beginning of something she would have called surrender in anyone else, but in him looked more like a decision, a deliberate choice to put trust somewhere. Okay, he said simply. She went back to work. Titan found water on the afternoon of the 2nd day, a seep coming from beneath a rock formation about 40 meters from the crevice. She had followed him there, moving slowly, using the terrain for cover, letting him guide her at his pace and in his direction. When she saw the seep, she had crouched down and pressed her forehead against the cool stone above it and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of something that wasn't quite emotion, but was the release of a pressure she hadn't realized had been building. Then she filled every container she had and went back to her team. She boiled the water with the last of her fuel tabs. She rationed it. She tracked who drank how much and when. She maintained records in her head, temperature trends, wound progression, mental status, assessments, hydration levels with a precision that would have impressed the most experienced field surgeons, because precision was the difference between making it and not making it, and she was not going to be the variable that made the difference in the wrong direction. That 2nd night, Daniel's fever climbed. She sat beside him for 3 hours monitoring it, doing the limited things available to her to manage it, and during that time, Daniel did something she hadn't expected from him. He talked, not about the mission, not about the tactical situation, about home, about a daughter named Sadie who was 8 years old and who had recently decided she wanted to be a marine biologist, about the way Sadie laughed full-body unself-conscious, the kind of laugh that filled a room, about a conversation they'd had 2 weeks before deployment about whether sharks had feelings, and how Daniel had spent an entire evening researching it on his phone because he refused to give his daughter an answer he wasn't sure about. Sharks have something called social behavior, he told Ava quietly. They're not the solitary killing machines people think they are. Some species travel in groups, show preference for certain companions. Sadie was right about that. Sounds like a smart kid, Ava said. Smartest person I know, Daniel said. Don't tell Ryan I said that. Your secret. He was quiet for a while. Then you're going to get us home. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a statement either. It was something in between the sound of a man who had assessed a situation and reached a conclusion. That's the plan, Ava said. Good plan. Titan shifted, lifted his head, fixed his gaze on the entrance to the crevice. Ava's hand went immediately to her weapon. They stayed perfectly still for 45 seconds that felt like much longer time. Then Titan exhaled slowly and laid his head back down. Whatever he detected had moved on or moved away. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Good dog, Ryan said softly from across the crevice. Titan's tail moved. Once. A brief, dignified acknowledgement. The third day began with Ava making a decision. She had sent 17 radio transmissions over 47 hours. 17 requests for extraction. 17 acknowledgements that meant nothing. She was out of fuel tabs down to emergency rations, managing a deteriorating casualty situation with a depleted kit in territory where the people trying to kill him were still present and still looking. She sat alone at the entrance to the crevice in the pre-dawn darkness. Titan pressed against her side and she allowed herself to think through everything clearly. Honestly, without the softening that comes from hope, you're not sure you can afford. No one is coming, she thought. If they were coming, they would have come. She sat with that thought until it stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like a road. Then she went back to her team and she woke them up. Change of plans, she said. Her voice was steady. No drama in it, just information. We're moving out at first light. I'm going to need all of you to do something you're not going to want to do. I'm going to need you to trust me completely and do exactly what I say exactly when I say it. Not because you don't have your own judgment, because coordinating perfectly is the only way this works. Marcus was watching her with those dark, exhausted eyes. What's the plan? We're walking out. A beat of silence. Walking, Ryan said flatly. Walking. Carter, my legs. I know what your legs look like, she said. Not unkindly, matter-of-factly. I know exactly what your legs look like because I've been looking at them for 2 days. We're not walking out on your legs. I'm going to carry what can be carried, and we're going to move what can be moved, and Titan is going to make sure we do it safely. And we are going to walk out of these mountains, and we are going to go home. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Daniel Brooks, who chose his words more carefully than anyone she'd ever met, said simply, "Tell us what to do." And that was when Ava Carter decided that if the system that was supposed to protect these men had failed them, then she was going to become the system. She was going to be the rescue. She was going to be the extraction. She was going to be everything they needed her to be for as long as it took across whatever ground it required. Because those men were her responsibility. And as long as they were breathing, she was not leaving. Not for any reason. Not for any price. Not for anyone. The first pale light of the third morning was beginning to find the edges of the rocks around them when Titan stood up stretched, shook himself once, and looked at her with those steady amber eyes. Ready, that look said? Yeah, she said quietly. Me too. She shouldered her pack, checked her weapon, confirmed positions of her team, and began the work of bringing them home. The first step was the hardest, not because of the terrain, not because of the weight, but because the moment Ava Carter moved her team out of that crevice and into open ground, she was making a declaration. She was saying out loud with her body and her choices and everything she had left, we are not waiting anymore. We are going to do this ourselves. Ryan Walker couldn't walk. That was the plain truth of it, and she had stopped softening plain truths 24 hours ago. His legs had been stabilized as well as she could manage without a proper surgical setup, but stabilized didn't mean functional, and functional was what walking required. She had looked at him that morning, looked at his legs, looked at the distance they had to cover, and done the math in her head without flinching. She built a drag system out of her pack frame, 2 lengths of paracord she'd been carrying since day one, and the emergency thermal blanket from her kit. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't comfortable, but it would move him without reopening the worst of his wounds if they were careful, and careful was something she could control. This is embarrassing, Ryan said, looking at the improvised litter. It worked, Ava said. I outweigh you by 60 pounds. I know. Carter. Ryan. She looked at him directly. Save it for the after-action report. Right now I need you on that litter. He pressed his lips together, got on the litter. Marcus could walk barely with Daniel's support on his left side. The chest wound was the thing she worried about most. The sucking quality of it had diminished over the past day, which was either a good sign or a sign of a different problem she didn't want to think about too hard. She had resealed it twice, watched his breathing patterns obsessively, and made him promise to tell her immediately if anything changed in how his lungs felt. Define changed, Marcus had said. If it gets harder, if it feels wrong, if anything is different from how it felt an hour ago. And if I'm not sure, tell me anyway. Got it. Daniel was managing his shoulder through sheer refusal to acknowledge it. The fever had come down slightly overnight, not enough but slightly, and he moved with the controlled economy of a man who had decided pain was a data point and not a deciding factor. He took Marcus's weight on his good side, and they began to move. Titan went 10 meters ahead, always 10 meters, close enough to recall instantly, far enough to give her warning. They had been moving for 20 minutes when Titan stopped. Ava stopped. Everyone stopped. The silence was immediate and complete. Titan stood perfectly still, his body angled slightly, left ears fully forward. She watched him for 3 seconds. He didn't move, didn't look back at her. Down, she said quietly. Not loudly, not a shout, just a word spoken at normal volume with absolute authority. All 3 men went down without question or hesitation. Ryan hit the ground hard, and she saw him absorb the pain without making a sound. Daniel pulled Marcus down beside him and put his hand over Marcus's mouth, not out of force, just in case, the way a man does when he's been in enough situations to know that even unconscious sounds carry farther than you think. Ava went flat. Titan still hadn't moved. The sound came 40 seconds later. Voices, low male speaking Pashto coming from somewhere above and to the left. Not close enough to be immediate, close enough to matter. She counted the voices, 3, maybe 4, moving parallel to their position. Not approaching, not yet. She looked at Titan. He was tracking the sound with his ears, his body still perfectly controlled. She waited. 30 seconds, a minute. The voices moved past, faded. Titan's ears relaxed by 2 degrees, barely perceptible to anyone who hadn't spent 18 months learning to read him, and she took that as her signal. Moving, she breathed. They adjusted their route by 40 meters to the right and kept going. That was the first close call of the morning. The second came an hour later when Marcus stumbled on a loose section of ground and went down hard on his right side, and the impact was enough that she heard him inhale sharply in a way that meant something had changed with the chest wound. She was at his side before he finished falling. Talk to me, she said immediately, her hands already moving. I'm okay, I think. Don't tell me what you think, tell me what you feel. Marcus put a careful hand against his right side. His expression ran through something complicated: assessment, recognition, decision. It's tighter, he finally said. It's tighter than it was. She had him breathe for her. Watch the movement. Compared it to what she'd been tracking. Something was shifting in there, not catastrophic, not immediately, but the direction of travel was wrong. Okay, she said. Her voice was calm. Her brain was running the options in rapid parallel. Okay, we're going to adjust your dressing, and I need you to breathe as shallowly as comfortable for the next 30 minutes. Can you do that? Shallow breathing. Yeah. And you're going to tell me the second anything changes. I told you the second it changed just now. Good, keep doing that. She worked quickly, redressed the wound, made a decision about the remaining supplies in her kit, redistributing, prioritizing, accepting that some contingencies she'd been holding resources for were now going to go unresourced. You work with what you have. You always work with what you have. Daniel was watching her when she stood up. He didn't say anything. She met his eyes and gave him a small nod that meant manageable. Not fine, but manageable. He accepted that. They kept moving. Hour 3, hour 4. Hour 4 was when Ava Carter first heard the enemy radio traffic. It came from an elevated position somewhere off their right flank. She couldn't see the source, but the sound traveled cleanly in the cold air. She didn't speak Pashto fluently, but she'd been in country long enough to pick up operational phrases, and what she was hearing made the hair on the back of her neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She stopped, listened. Her brain worked to parse what she was catching. Coordinates. She recognized the format. She recognized the area descriptors, valley names she had been briefed on. Then something else. A phrase she needed to sit with for a moment to fully understand. American team, believed neutralized. She stared at a fixed point in front of her and let the implications of that land. They believe we're dead, she thought. They have been operating under the assumption that the Americans are gone, which means they haven't been hunting. They've been moving freely, planning freely. And if they're planning freely, the next phrase she caught hit her like cold water. A date, 7 days from now. A location she recognized as a forward operating base, not Fort Liberty, but close enough to it to matter enormously. And a number. She didn't catch all of it, but she caught enough. Enough to know that what she was hearing was an operational briefing, a timeline for something significant, something that was going to happen whether or not anyone knew about it, unless someone who knew the right people told them in time. She stayed perfectly still until the radio traffic ended. Then she turned to Daniel, who had been watching her face the entire time and clearly reading that something had shifted. "What did you hear?" he asked quietly. She looked at him steadily. "We have to move faster," she said. He didn't press her. He simply straightened, adjusted his grip on Marcus and said, "Tell us what you need." They moved faster. The next hour was the hardest physical work Ava Carter had ever done in her life. She said that to herself plainly internally without drama. She had done hard things before. She had trained in conditions designed to break people, and she had not broken. But pulling a 180-plus-pound man on an improvised litter across mountain terrain while managing a deteriorating medical situation and navigating around enemy activity was a category of difficulty that existed outside what any training had actually prepared her for. It existed in the place where training becomes either useful or not, depending entirely on the person who received it. It was useful. Everything she had ever been taught, every long night at Bragg, every scenario that had seemed excessive at the time, all of it was useful now. But it was still the hardest thing she had ever done. Ryan knew it. He couldn't see her face from his position on the litter, but he'd been tracking the sound of her breathing for the past hour. He told her that later, and he'd heard it change. The control required to maintain a consistent pace when your body is telling you to stop is a sound, apparently. He'd heard it. "Carter," he said. "Don't," she said. "I'm just going to say, Ryan, I know what you're going to say, and I don't need you to say it. Save your oxygen." "My oxygen is fine." "Good. Keep it that way." "Carter." "Walker." A pause. "Yeah, I've got you. Okay, I've got you. Just let me work." Another pause. Longer. "Okay," he said, and then quieter almost to himself. "Yeah, okay." She kept pulling. Hour 6 brought the first confirmation that the enemy was actively searching. Titan came back to her faster than his normal pace, not running, but quick, purposeful, the body language of a boy who has found something that requires a decision. She read him immediately, held up a fist. Everyone stopped. "What is it?" Daniel asked. "Movement, multiple. Behind us." "How far?" "Far enough." "Not far enough." She was already calculating him. The terrain, the pace, the options. "We need a different line. We need to go through the low section instead of around it. The low section adds 40 minutes. "I know." "Marcus." "I know." She looked at Marcus directly. "Tell me honestly, right now, can you do 40 minutes harder than what we've been doing?" Marcus's face was the color of old concrete. His lips were dry, despite the water she'd rationed to him every 30 minutes. But his eyes were clear, and when he spoke, the steadiness in his voice was real and not performed. "I can do whatever you need me to do," he said. "That's not what I asked." "Carter." He held her gaze. "I understand what happens if those people behind us catch up. So I'm telling you I can do it. Don't ask me again." She nodded. "Through the low section. Stay close." The low section was harder. She had known it would be harder, and she had chosen it anyway because the alternative was worse. She pulled Ryan through places where the terrain resisted her, where the physics of it fought her, where every meter of ground cost twice what normal terrain would have cost. She didn't stop. She didn't slow to a walk she could maintain indefinitely. She moved at the pace the situation required, and she paid whatever it cost. Daniel stumbled once. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of his boot catching the grunt of a man absorbing impact through a body that was running low on reserve. He recovered immediately, barely broke stride, but she heard it, and she filed it. "You're doing great," she told him when she came even with him. "I've been better," he said. "We all have. You're still doing great." Something crossed his face. She identified it as gratitude and let it go without making it bigger than it needed to be. Titan cleared the low section first. He came back to her with a different quality in his movement, something that told her the ground ahead had changed. She trusted it. They came through the last difficult section, and the terrain opened marginally, not easy. Nothing about this was easy but navigable in a way that let her breathe differently. She checked Marcus, checked Ryan, checked Daniel's color and the set of his shoulder and the steadiness of his eyes. Made assessments, made decisions, kept moving. Hour 7 was when the twist that had been building since she heard that radio traffic finally resolved itself into something she could fully understand. They took a short rest, 5 minutes, not 1 second more, in a position Titan had cleared. Everyone down, everyone drinking. Ava changed Marcus's dressing by touch and speed, working fast. And while she worked, her mind kept turning over what she had heard in that radio communication, fitting pieces together with things she had known before the mission and things she had observed during it. The ambush had been too clean. She had thought that in the first minutes, and she had set the thought aside because the immediate situation demanded everything. But it had been too clean. The positioning, the timing, the way the fire had come from angles that covered every standard response to contact. You didn't set that up by chance. You set that up with information, specific, detailed operational information. Someone had known where they were going to be. Someone had known the route, the timing, the team composition, the insertion point. Someone with access to that information had shared it. She sat with that for exactly long enough to confirm it felt true. Then she sat with the second part. The extraction requests, she had made 17 of them, had received technical acknowledgement. Someone was monitoring those transmissions, which meant someone in the chain of command knew they were alive, knew they were still transmitting, knew they were still requesting help, and had made a decision to let them stay out there. Who benefits from this team not coming home, she asked herself. Who had both the access to set up that ambush and the authority to slow walk an extraction without anyone asking too many questions? She didn't have a name yet, but the shape of what she was looking at was clear enough to act on. "Ryan," she said. He turned his head toward her. "Your radio, I need to use the secondary frequency, the one that bypasses standard operations channels." Ryan stared at her. Understanding moved across his face. "You think our transmissions are being monitored? I think it's possible. You think someone in our chain? I think we shouldn't discuss what I think until we're somewhere safe and I can say it in front of people who will document it." She held his gaze. The secondary frequency. Ryan was quiet for 3 seconds that contained a significant amount of thought. Then he reached into his kit and gave her the information she needed. She made the transmission short, a position update, casualty status, a specific code that Ryan told her was a duress indicator, a signal that told whoever received it that normal communication channels could not be trusted. She used the code. She transmitted the position. Then she put the radio down and stood up. 5 minutes is up, she said. We're moving. Nobody argued. Nobody needed encouragement. The 3 men who had come into these mountains as the best operators their country produced and had been left here to die looked at each other, and then at the woman who had kept them breathing, and then at the dog who had kept them safe, and they got up. They moved. Hour 8, hour 9. By hour 9, Ava was running on something beyond physical resources. She knew what the clinical definition of that state was. She knew the neuroscience, the physiological mechanisms, the point at which the body begins consuming itself to maintain function. She was in that zone, had been for a while. The kind of tired that isn't just muscle fatigue, but is something deeper, something at the level of cells, something that whispers at the edges of your perception that stopping would feel very good. She didn't stop. She thought about what stopping would mean. She thought about Ryan's wife who made red beans and rice every Sunday. She thought about Daniel's daughter Sadie, who was going to be a marine biologist because sharks have social behavior, and she was right about that. She thought about Marcus, who had thrown himself across open ground to drag a wounded man behind a boulder without a second's hesitation, who had taken a chest wound doing an act of grace for someone else. She thought not today. She kept pulling. Marcus fell behind once into hour 9, and the moment she noticed the gap and she stopped, went back to him. He was standing still, one hand pressed against his chest, his face doing something complicated. "Talk," she said immediately. "It's different again," he said. His voice was tight, controlled through effort. Same side or other side? Same, but higher. She had her hand on his chest in the next breath, feeling the movement of it, listening to what her fingers could tell her. Something was shifting in there. Something that had been borderline for a long time was moving toward a threshold. She pulled out what remained of her kit and started working. Daniel stood beside them, facing back the way they'd come, watching. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "Marcus," she said while her hands worked, "I need you to tell me about your wife." He blinked. "What? Your wife, the woman who makes red beans and rice. Tell me about her." Why, because I need to know you're staying with me. Talk." He talked, halting at first, then more steadily, as she worked, as the familiar shapes of familiar memories gave him something to hold on to. He talked about Diane, who had been his high school girlfriend before she was his wife, who drove too fast on the highway and sang badly to the radio, and was the most unsentimental person he'd ever met in his life, except for the way she cried at dog food commercials, which she denied consistently and which he had seen with his own eyes on 4 separate occasions. Ava listened. She worked. She stabilized what she could stabilize with what she had left. "How's the rice?" she asked when she was done. Marcus looked at her. Something in his eyes had steadied. "Best you've ever had," he said. "Good. Then let's make sure you get home to eat it." She got him back on his feet, got them all moving again. The base Fort Liberty Forward Operations Base was still miles ahead of them, miles that felt right now like a distance she measured not in miles but in decisions. One decision at a time, one step at a time, one breath at a time. Titan ranged 10 meters ahead. Steady, consistent, perfect. Her dog had not failed her once in 3 days in these mountains. She had given him commands that asked more of him than she was comfortable asking. He had responded to every one of them with a precision that had saved their lives. She made a silent promise to the back of his dark head, moving through the terrain ahead of her. Whatever you want for the rest of your life, you're getting it. By the time the darkness began to come down at the end of the 3rd day, Ava had made peace with something. Not peace that meant acceptance or resignation, peace that meant clarity. The kind of clarity you reach when you have looked at every option clearly and honestly and have chosen the hardest one and are at peace with having chosen it. She was going to get them home. All 3 of them, alive. Not because it was easy, not because the odds were good, not because anyone was coming to help, but because she had decided somewhere back in those mountains that the decision had already been made. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a fact she was in the process of making true. Ryan broke the silence after a long stretch of movement. "Carter." "Yeah. Thank you." She pulled him another step forward before she answered. "Don't thank me yet. I'm thanking you now, in case." She thought about telling him there was no in case. She almost said it. Then she decided the honest thing, the thing that respected who he was to just receive it. "You're welcome," she said, and then she kept going. The darkness came down fast in those mountains. It always did. 1 hour you had enough light to navigate by, and the next hour the world had compressed itself into whatever your hands could reach and whatever your ears could process. And everything beyond that was assumption and instinct. Ava didn't stop moving when the light went. She had expected to. She had planned to find a defensible position before dark, rest the team through the worst of the night hours, move again before first light. That was the plan she had built in her head across the long hours of the day. But plans are made from information, and information changes, and the information she now had, the radio traffic, the coordinates, the timeline, the date 7 days out had changed the calculation in a way she couldn't ignore. If she stopped for the night, she lost 8 hours. 8 hours was the difference between information arriving in time and information arriving too late. She told them while they were still moving because stopping to have the conversation felt like a luxury. "Change of plan," she said. Her voice was steady, matter of fact, the same voice she used when she was telling someone their blood pressure was elevated, important information delivered without panic. We're not stopping for the night. Ryan processed this from the litter. Define not stopping. Not stopping means not stopping. A pause. Carter, it's going to be dark in 20 minutes. I know. Moving at night in this terrain is harder. Yes, I know. She pulled him forward another step. I also know that what I heard on that radio this afternoon can't wait until morning. So we're moving. Another pause. Longer this time. Ryan was doing the same calculation she was doing, and she trusted him to arrive at the same place. Titan can work in the dark, he said finally. Not a question, a statement offered in support. Better than we can, she confirmed. Then tell us what you need. She gave them each a role. Daniel would maintain contact with Marcus on his left side and track their bearing using the small compass he carried on his wristband. Ryan would alert her immediately if his pain crossed a threshold that affected his ability to stay quiet, because sound discipline in the dark was everything. Marcus would breathe steadily and report any change in his chest, no matter how small, and Titan would lead. She gave the dog the command that meant careful advance the hand signal delivered at his eye level in the last of the usable light. Titan looked at her for one long moment, those amber eyes holding steady, and then turned and moved forward into the dark. They followed. Hour 10 was the longest hour Ava Carter had ever lived through. Moving at night across mountain terrain with 3 wounded men was a category of difficulty that required her to be 3 things simultaneously: physically strong enough to keep pulling, mentally alert enough to process everything Titan was communicating, and emotionally stable enough to project the kind of steadiness that kept 3 men who were in significant pain from losing their grip on the composure that was keeping them functional. She was all 3 things. She didn't ask herself how. She just was, because she had to be, because there was no one else. Daniel spoke quietly beside her during a brief pause to reassess direction. "The date you heard," he said. He kept his voice down. "Just for her." "How certain are you about it?" "Certain enough," she said. "And the location, certain." He was quiet for a moment. "Then how many people are we talking about at that FOB on that date?" She had done the math already. She told him the number. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. "Okay," he said. "That was all. Just okay." The word of a man who had received the information and filed it and was now operating with it as a fixed variable. "The secondary transmission I sent," Ava said. "If it reached the right people." "If," Daniel said. "Yeah, if." Another pause. "Then we make sure it did," he said. "We get home. We make sure." They kept moving. 40 minutes into the night march, Titan stopped. He stopped differently this time. Not the lateral ear-forward alert of a sound detected at distance. He stopped and came back to her. Actually reversed his direction and came back, which was a behavior she had seen from him exactly twice before, both times when the threat ahead was immediate enough that he had judged it better to report than to hold position. She stopped, everyone with a touch hand on Daniel's arm, pressure only, no sound. Everyone froze. Titan pressed against her left leg. She put her hand on his back and felt what she was looking for. He was trembling. Not from cold, from the controlled tension of a body who is containing a response because his handler has not yet told him what to do with it. She put her mouth close to his ear. "Easy," she breathed. "Show me." He turned, moved forward at half his normal pace. She followed him, one hand on his back, the other on her weapon. 12 steps. 15. He stopped again, and she stopped with him. She listened. Voices. Again, but not moving parallel this time, stationary. Close enough that she could hear individual words without being able to see the source. 2 voices, maybe 3, in low conversation. The sound of equipment, the sound of something being set down on hard ground. A position, an observation post, set up directly across the route she had been planning to use. Her mind ran options in rapid sequence. Go around, added time, added risk of losing their bearing in the dark. Wait how long they could be there all night. Go through not viable with 3 wounded men and no element of surprise. There was a 4th option. She looked at it carefully, turned it over, measured the risk against the alternative. She went back to Daniel and put her mouth close to his ear. She told him the 4th option in 12 words. He was still for 2 seconds. Then he nodded once. She went to Ryan next, told him the same thing. He closed his eyes briefly, not from fear, she thought, but from the specific frustration of a man who cannot participate in what's about to happen the way he would want to. Then he nodded. Marcus last. He heard her, looked at her. You sure? He mouthed. She nodded. He nodded back. She gave Titan the command he knew, the one that meant, stay with the package guard, do not move until I return. He sat immediately pressed against Ryan's litter, and his body language shifted into something that was barely a dog anymore. He became stillness. He became watchfulness. He became whatever Ryan and Marcus and Daniel needed him to be while she was gone. She moved toward the voices alone. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not something she planned in detail before she did it. Planning in detail required more information than she had. What she had instead was training instinct and the absolute clarity of a person who has already accepted the worst possible outcome and is therefore free to function without the weight of fear. She used the terrain. She used the darkness. She used the fact that the men at that position believed the Americans in these mountains were dead, which meant their alertness was oriented toward threat from the outside, from other direction, and not from someone already inside their perimeter. When it was over, the position was no longer occupied. She went back to her team. She picked up the litter. She said, moving, and they moved. Nobody asked her what had happened. She told them anyway, briefly, factually, because these were men who deserved to know the truth of their situation and not a managed version of it. Ryan said, you went out there alone. Yes. With no backup. Yes. Carter. It worked, she said, a long pause from the litter behind her. Yeah, Ryan said. It did. And he said nothing else about it. Hour 11, hour 12. Somewhere in hour 12, Marcus began to struggle in a way that was different from the struggle she had been managing for the past 2 days. She heard it in his breathing before she saw it in anything else. A change in the rhythm, a shallowness that had crossed from careful management into something involuntary. She stopped them immediately. Marcus, what are you feeling right now? He was working to keep his voice level. She could hear the effort in it. Pressure, he said, more than before, right side. She had a specific fear. She had been managing that fear since the second day, holding it in a compartment labeled, not yet keeping it there, with careful wound management and positioning and the sheer force of her clinical attention. The fear had a clinical name. It was the thing she had been preventing. And now she was standing in the dark in the mountains of Afghanistan with none of the equipment required to properly treat it and a man in front of her who needed it treated. She worked by touch, by memory, by every hour of training she had ever thought was excessive. She used the last of her needle decompression supplies she had been carrying one from the beginning, because you carry one in your kit and you use it when you need it and you pray you don't need it. And she used it now, precisely finding the landmark by touch, counting ribs with her fingertips in the dark, placing the needle where it needed to go. The sound that followed was the sound of a problem that had just been partially solved. Not completely, partially. Marcus exhaled a long, shaking exhale and said, "Oh, yeah, yeah." "Better?" she asked. "Better," he confirmed. His voice was still thin, but the tightness had changed. The edge of crisis had stepped back. She gave him 30 seconds, then "We have to keep moving." "I know." He pulled himself upright with Daniel's help. "I know. Let's go." That was the moment right there in the dark, after everything, that she allowed herself 1 second of something that felt like awe. Not at herself, at them. At the sheer refusal of these 3 men to be anything other than what they were. They had every reason to be broken by this, and they simply were not. They chose over and over to not be broken, and the choosing itself was a kind of courage she had no adequate word for. She filed the feeling away, kept moving. Hour 13 brought the first indication that her secondary transmission might have been received. She caught it at the edge of Titan's hearing range, the distinctive sound of rotor wash, distant directional, moving across the sky above the ridge to the north. A helicopter. Moving without lights. Moving at an altitude and pattern that was not consistent with a standard transit flight. It was a search pattern. Someone was running a search pattern. She didn't let herself believe too much. A search pattern could be looking for anything. It could be enemy aviation. It could be an operation that had nothing to do with them. She tracked the sound until it faded and filed it as a data point, possible, not confirmed, and kept her team moving. Daniel had heard it too. "That's one of ours," he said. Quiet, confident. "Maybe. That's a pattern I've seen run 100 times. That's one of ours looking for something in the dark." She looked at him in the near darkness. "Then let's give them something to find." She made another transmission on the secondary frequency. Short, position only, no voice, just the code indicator. She sent it twice, waited 15 seconds, sent it once more. Then she put the radio away and kept pulling. 40 minutes later, something happened that changed everything. Titan stopped again. Same behavior as before the reversal. The return to her, the trembling tension of contained response. But the direction he had come from was different this time. Not ahead, not to the saws, behind them. She turned. In the darkness behind them, something was following. Not close, but consistent, maintaining distance, pacing them. She felt the specific cold of a threat that had found them and was choosing its moment. How many, she asked Titan, which was not a question the dog could technically answer, except that she had been asking him questions for 2 years, and the answer lived in how he responded to the question, the set of his body, the quality of his focus, what he did with his ears. He fixed his attention on a point roughly 50 meters back and slightly elevated. Single point, not tracking multiple directions, one person, maybe two. Daniel, she said. Her voice was absolutely level. Take Marcus and Ryan and move to that position 20 meters left. Don't stop and don't make noise. And you, Daniel said, I'll be right behind you. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Carter. 20 meters left, Daniel, now. He went. He moved Marcus and Ryan and he went, and the sound of their movement covered whatever else was happening for 30 seconds, which was what she needed. She gave Titan the hold command and stepped back into the darkest shadow she could find and waited. The follower came forward when the sounds of movement stopped. Slow, cautious. The caution of someone who is not certain what they have been following. She saw the shape before the shape saw her, and in the moment before anything else happened, something resolved itself at the back of her mind with the sudden clarity of a picture coming into focus. The follower wasn't moving like an enemy combatant. The follower was moving like someone who was trying not to be heard by the same people they were. She held every instinct at bay, all of it, the training and the adrenaline and the certainty that had been keeping her alive. And instead of acting, she waited. 1 more second. 2. The shape stopped moving entirely. And in the dark, a voicemail, low and accented but clear English, said, American medic, do not shoot. I am looking for the American medic. She did not move, did not breathe, assessed. The voice came again. My name is Fareed. I have been following your group since the ridge. I was at the place where they were talking. I heard things. I know things about what is planned. I am trying to reach you before... Stop moving, she said. Her voice came from a different position than he was facing. She had already repositioned. Old habit, he stopped. You are the medic, he asked. Who wants to know? My cousin works at the base, the American base. I have tried for 2 days to find a way to pass information, and I could not. And then I heard the radio in the valley, a woman's voice using a code. And I thought, if she is still alive, if the team is still alive, talk, she said, fast. He talked. And what he told her in the next 4 minutes, standing in the dark in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, was the piece that completed the picture she had been assembling since the first hour of the ambush. The attack on the FOB was not the only target. The ambush, the one that had killed Torres and wounded her team, had been the first step in a coordinated sequence. The information that had created the ambush had come from inside the American command structure. And the man responsible for suppressing the extraction requests was not acting alone. He had a handler, someone outside the military, someone who had been feeding operational information for months in exchange for something Ava didn't fully understand yet, but that Fareed was trying to explain with an urgency that she believed was genuine. She listened to everything. She asked 3 specific questions. She evaluated the answers against everything she already knew. Then she made a decision. Can you get to the base? She asked. Not safely, not alone. With us, a pause. Possibly. Then stay close to the dog. Do exactly what the dog does. Don't make decisions without asking me first. And if you're lying to me about any of this, understand that I will know it. Silence. I am not lying, Fareed said simply. She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. Then she made the call that every trained instinct told her to verify more carefully and that something deeper told her was right. Then let's move, she said. She went back to her team. Introduce Fareed in 12 words. Watch Daniel's face during those 12 words, the rapid assessment of a man who had evaluated human beings in high-stakes situations for 15 years. Daniel looked at Fareed for 3 seconds, looked at Ava, nodded. That was enough. But we're adding one, Ava said. Same rules apply. Move when I move, stop. When I stop, trust the dog. Marcus looked at Fareed with eyes that were exhausted but clear. You know a way out of these mountains. A way that avoids the main routes, Fareed said. Yes. Then, brother, Marcus said slowly, I am very glad you found us. Something crossed Fareed's face. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated and more real. He looked at Ava. How far? She calculated. Added the new route. Measured it against what her body had left and what her team had left and what needed to happen before dawn. Far enough, she said. But we're going to make it. She picked up the litter. Titan moved forward into the dark. And 5 people, 3 wounded operators, 1 woman who had been declared dead, 1 man who had decided tonight that being on the right side of history was worth whatever it cost, moved together toward the lights they couldn't see yet, but knew were there. They moved because she moved. They kept going because she kept going. And she kept going because the alternative was not something she was capable of choosing. Not for these men, not ever. Fareed's route was harder than the one she'd been planning. He had warned her about that, and she had said it didn't matter, and she had meant it. What it lacked in ease, it made up for in something more important. It was the route nobody was watching. The enemy had positioned their observation posts along the natural lines of movement, the corridors that any trained navigator would default to the paths that geography recommended. Fareed's route went through the places geography argued against, and that argument was exactly why it was safe. Safe being a relative term. Everything was relative now. They moved through the early hours of the morning in a formation that had evolved organically over the past hour into something almost choreographed. Fareed 2 steps ahead of her, pointing out ground hazards in a whisper so quiet it barely existed. Titan slightly to the right of Fareed, reading him, building a working picture of whether this man's body language continued to match his words. Ava pulling the litter, Daniel and Marcus behind her, the whole group moving at a pace determined entirely by what Marcus's chest could sustain and what Ryan's pain threshold allowed. Ryan had gone quiet in the last hour. Not unconscious, she checked him every 15 minutes, got a verbal response each time, but quiet in the way that people go quiet when they have used up the words they had and are running on something beyond language. She recognized it. She had seen it in other patients in other situations. It wasn't surrender, it was conservation. Walker, she said during one of the checks. Still here, he said. His voice was rough but present. Red beans and rice, she said. A pause, then something that might have been a very small, very tired laugh. Yeah, he said. Yeah, okay. It was a code between them now. Though neither of them had named it as such, it meant you have a reason to get there. Remember it? Hold on to it. She pulled him forward another 10 meters, and then another 10, and then another. Hour 14 was when they heard the sound that changed everything for the second time in 12 hours. Titan heard it first. He stopped, lifted his head, and his ears moved in the specific way that meant he was tracking something aerial. Not threat posture, something else. Something that made him stand differently attentive rather than defensive. Ava stopped. Listened. Rotor wash. Closer than before. Much closer. And below the ridge, this time not above it, which meant whatever was in the air had descended into the valley, which meant it was looking for something specific and had narrowed its search area. Daniel put his hand on her arm. That's a Black Hawk, he said. Certain. Completely certain. I know that sound at 100 meters. That is a Black Hawk running dark. She made the decision in under 3 seconds. Signal, she said. She pulled the emergency signal device from her kit. She had been carrying it since the beginning. One of the items she had not yet used because using it required accepting the risk of being found by the wrong people first. She had assessed that risk every hour for 3 days and declined to take it. Now the calculation had changed. She activated it. The device sent a burst transmission on the emergency frequency, short encoded location specific. Then she powered it off immediately and waited. The rotor sound changed. The pattern shifted. Something in the way it moved through the air above them told Daniel she could see it in his face that it had received something and was responding. Move left, she said to Fareed. 20 meters, fastest you can go. They moved left. She pulled the litter over ground that fought her and didn't care. Marcus pushed himself at a pace that cost him, and she heard it in his breathing, and she pulled faster to shorten the time that pace was required. They reached a wider, flat area, not large, but large enough and she activated the signal again. 3 seconds. Off. The Black Hawk came over the ridge like something out of a decision someone had made very fast and with a great deal of commitment. It came in low and direct and without hesitation, and the downdraft hit them all at once, cold and forceful, and the most beautiful thing Ava Carter had felt in 72 hours. And then the side door opened, and a voice came down, a voice using Ryan Walker's full name and rank, and Ryan answered from the litter in a voice that cracked on the second syllable and held itself together for the rest by sheer refusal. "That's us," Ava said loudly, not caring any more about noise discipline, because noise discipline was a problem that had just been solved. "That is all of us. I have 3 wounded. 1 needs surgical priority. Let's move." They moved. Getting Ryan into the aircraft required 3 people and produced a sound from him that she knew he'd be embarrassed about later, and that she was going to tell him when they were safe that he had earned every single sound he ever needed to make. Marcus went up next, helped by 2 pairs of hands from inside the aircraft. Daniel went last, and before he climbed in, he turned and looked at her with an expression that she had no adequate language for, and that she wasn't sure he did either. "Carter," he said, "get in the helicopter, Daniel." He got in the helicopter. She looked at Fareed. "You're coming with us." He looked at the aircraft, at the uniformed personnel inside it, at the journey that getting into that aircraft represented for a man in his position. "They will have questions for me," he said. "Yes, and you'll answer them, and it will be fine." She met his eyes steadily. "I give you my word." He held her gaze for one long moment, then he nodded and climbed aboard. She went in last, pulling Titan up behind her, and the moment her boots cleared the deck, the aircraft was already lifting. She sat against the interior wall with Titan pressed against her side and let the reality of it land. They were off the ground. They were going home. Titan put his head in her lap and she put her hand on him, and neither of them moved for the entire duration of the flight. The aircraft touched down at Fort Liberty Forward Operations Base at 03:47. What happened in the next 90 seconds had been described differently by every person present, because the event was large enough that each person watching it processed a different part of it and remembered that part most clearly. But the core of it, the irreducible center that everyone agreed on, was this: the woman who had been declared dead 3 days ago stepped off a Black Hawk helicopter with a Belgian Malinois at her side, and she was pulling the litter that held Ryan Walker. And behind her were Marcus Hale and Daniel Brooks, and every one of them was alive. The lookout who spotted them first didn't say anything for a full 4 seconds. Later, he said he thought he was seeing something wrong with his eyes. Then he hit the alert, and the base began to wake up. The medical teams were ready. Someone had communicated ahead. The aircraft had called in the casualty count, and they moved efficiently, professionally, taking over from Ava in a handoff that she managed with the same precision she had maintained for 3 days. She gave them everything wound status, treatment timeline, what she'd used, what she hadn't, what she was worried about, what was stable, what needed immediate attention. She gave it in the clipped, accurate language of a professional, handing a case to another professional. And when she was done, and they had her patience, she stepped back and allowed herself to stop. Just stop for one moment. Titan sat beside her. He leaned against her leg. She put her hand on his head. Around her, the base was fully awake now, and the crowd that had formed was not moving and not making the sounds that crowds usually make. It was making the sound of a group of people who were trying to process something too large for immediate processing. Some of them had been to the memorial service. Informal because no bodies had been recovered, but a gathering. There had been a gathering. And then a voice cut through the stillness in a way that Ava recognized immediately. Captain Ethan Graves. He was pushing through the crowd toward her. His face was doing several things at once, and the thing it was doing most prominently was not the thing she might have expected. It was not relief. It was not even shame. It was the specific expression of a man who has seen something he was not supposed to see and is very rapidly calculating what it means for him. She watched him come. "Carter," he said. His voice was controlled, professionally warm, the voice of a commander greeting a returned soldier. "My God, when we got the transmission..." "Captain Graves," she said. Her voice was level, entirely level. The leveler of someone who has had 3 days in the mountains to decide exactly what they are going to say and to whom and when. He stopped 2 feet from her. Something in her tone had registered. Something had told him that whatever script he was running was not going to play the way he needed it to play. "We need to get you to medical," he said. "Still warm, still controlled. You need to be looked at. You've been out there for 3 days." "I've been out there for 72 hours, she said, "because no one came to get us." A pause measured. The situation was complex. There were factors. 17 transmissions, she said. He stopped. "I sent 17 separate transmissions over 72 hours. I gave position, casualty status, and extraction coordinates. Everyone was acknowledged. No extraction came." She held his gaze without any particular emotion in her face because she had moved past emotion into something more permanent. "I would like to understand the factors, Captain." The crowd around them had gone completely still. Graves was aware of it. She watched the awareness move across his face, the recalculation, the assessment of who was listening, the rapid inventory of what she could know and what she could prove. "This isn't the time or place," he said, quiet, controlled. The voice of a man trying to redirect a conversation. "Then when would you like to have it?" she asked. "Because I also have recordings, I have communications logs, and I have 3 Navy SEAL operators who are currently in your medical facility and are going to be asked what happened, and they are going to tell the truth." Something behind Graves' eyes went very still. The specific stillness of a man who has realized that the window he thought he had has just closed. "Carter," he said, one word, just her name. And in the way he said it, she heard the thing he was actually saying, a negotiation opening a warning, an appeal to a shared interest he was assuming they had. She had no such shared interest. "Sir," she said with a precision that made the word mean its opposite, "I would like to go check on my patients now." She walked past him. The crowd parted for her. Not dramatically, not like a movie, just people moved. Because she was moving, and because something about the way she moved made standing in her way not something anyone wanted to do. Titan walked beside her. Behind her, she was aware of Captain Graves standing in the space she had vacated, and of the crowd not parting for him the same way, and of the particular silence of people who had just heard something that had reorganized their understanding of the past 3 days. She pushed through the door to the medical facility and found her team. Ryan was already in surgery, fast, efficient, the kind of intervention that required no delay. She got a status update from the surgical team in the hallway, complicated, but manageable outlook, cautiously positive. He was going to be in recovery for a long time, but he was going to recover. She leaned against the wall of that hallway and breathed. Marcus was in the next bay. She went to him. He was on oxygen, an IV in his arm, a monitor tracking the vital signs she had been tracking in her head for 3 days. He looked for the first time since the ambush, like a man who might actually be comfortable. The tight vigilance in his face had let go. His eyes were closed. They opened when she came in. "Carter," he said. "Hey, we made it. We made it." He looked at her for a long moment. His face ran through something complicated and came out the other side at something simple. "Diane's going to want to thank you," he said. She shook her head. "Tell her to make the rice. That's enough." He smiled. The first full smile she had seen from him in 3 days. It changed his whole face. Daniel was sitting up in his bed when she found him, not lying down, sitting up straight with the specific posture of a man who refuses to be horizontal unless absolutely required. His shoulder was freshly dressed, and his temperature had been managed, and his eyes were clear and sharp in a way that said the fever had broken. He looked at her when she came in and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Sadie's going to ask me about this. What are you going to tell her?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "I'm going to tell her that sometimes the best soldier in the room isn't the one with the most rank," he said, "and that sharks aren't the only ones with instincts worth paying attention to." She laughed. She hadn't expected to. It came out of her suddenly genuine and surprised, and it was the first time she had laughed in 3 days, and it felt like something releasing that had been held too long. Daniel smiled. A rare thing she was learning, valuable because of it. She sat with him for 20 minutes. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The conversation that mattered had mostly already happened in a crevice in the mountains during long, cold hours, in the specific language of people who have been through something together that most people will never experience. When she left his room, the hallway outside was not the same hallway she had walked through before. 2 military police officers were standing near the main entrance. An officer she didn't recognize, senior rank, the kind of rank that travels with authority. She didn't normally see at the base level was speaking quietly to the base commander. And standing slightly apart from the group, watching the exchange, was Fareed. He looked at her when she came out. She crossed to him. "How are you?" she asked. "Waiting," he said. "They have questions." "I told you they would. You also told me it would be fine." "It will be," she paused. "The information you have, what you heard, what you know about the network, that information is going to matter. The people in that room are going to understand that you took a significant risk to bring it to us." He looked at her steadily. "And the officer, the one responsible." She glanced toward the entrance where Captain Graves was now standing in conversation with the senior officer in the military police. His posture had changed. The control she had seen in it 20 minutes ago had developed a hairline crack. Small, visible if you knew what to look for. "He's standing in a room with people who have my recordings and 3 operators who are going to tell the truth," she said. "He'll be fine or he won't, but that's not my problem anymore." Fareed followed her gaze, watched Graves for a moment. "He thought you were dead," Fareed said. "He made decisions because he believed you were dead. He made decisions that he intended to make you were dead," she corrected quietly. "There's a difference." A silence. "Yes," Fareed said, "there is." The senior officer peeled away from the group and walked toward her. He was a brigadier general. She read it from his insignia before he reached her, and he moved with the brisk efficiency of a man who had somewhere more important to be, but was choosing this instead because it mattered. He stopped in front of her, looked at her for a moment with the specific assessment of a person reading a situation from all angles simultaneously. "Sergeant Carter," he said. "Sir." "I'm General Hartwell. I received your secondary transmission 11 hours ago. I want to begin by saying that the use of the duress indicator on that channel was exactly correct, and that what happened subsequently," he paused. "Measured choosing his words is going to require a very thorough accounting." "Yes, sir," she said. "I have recordings. My team has testimony. And this man," she indicated Fareed, "has information about the network and the planned attack that I believe is time-sensitive." Hartwell looked at Fareed, looked back at Ava. "You trust him." It wasn't a question. He was reading the fact of it from her face. "I do," she said. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he turned to the officer beside him. "Get Mr. Fareed into a secure briefing, now, and get me the communications logs for the past 72 hours. He looked back at Ava. "You need to be medically evaluated." "My patients first." "Your patients are being treated by people whose job is treating them. Your job right now is to let someone look at you." She opened her mouth. "Sergeant," he said, and something in his voice, not hard but absolute, told her that this was the one order she was going to follow without negotiation. She closed her mouth. "Yes, sir." After which, he said, and something shifted in his tone, "I'd like to hear everything, from you, in your own words, all of it." She nodded. "All of it," she agreed. He started to turn away. Then he stopped. Looked back at her one more time with an expression she hadn't expected from a brigadier general, something almost personal, something past rank and protocol. "Sergeant," he said, "your people are alive because of you. I want to make sure you understand that that fact is not going to get lost in what comes next." She held his gaze, felt the weight of what he was telling her. Not thanks, something more precise than thanks. Recognition. The kind that comes from someone who understands what she had actually done and is saying so clearly. "Thank you, sir," she said. He nodded once and walked away. She looked at Titan, who was sitting at her heel with the patient certainty of a dog who has completed his assignment and is waiting to be told what comes next. She crouched down to his level, ran her hands along his face. His amber eyes were steady on hers. "We did it," she said quietly, just to him. "We actually did it." Titan's tail swept the floor once, slow, certain. The tail movement of a dog who had never doubted the outcome. She stood up, squared her shoulders, walked toward the medical bay to do the one thing she had been resisting for 3 days. Let someone take care of her. Somewhere across the base, behind a closed door, Captain Ethan Graves was sitting across a table from 2 military police officers and a brigadier general, and the story he had prepared, the narrative he had been building and refining for 72 hours, was meeting the facts that Ava Carter had carried out of those mountains on her back. The facts were winning. They always do eventually. They always do. The medical team found 7 things wrong with her. She didn't know that until the doctor sat down across from her in the exam room with a tablet and a face that carried the particular expression of a physician who has seen a lot and is still finding this one impressive. He listed them in clinical order: dehydration stage 2, soft tissue damage, both hands consistent with prolonged load bearing, lacerations across her right forearm, partially self-treated, requiring proper closure, hypothermia mild but genuine, a hairline fracture in her left ring finger that she had probably not noticed for at least 36 hours, infection developing at a wound site on her left calf that she had been aware of and had been managing and had not told anyone about because there was nothing to be done about it in the field. In exhaustion, he used the clinical term, but the clinical term meant the same thing as the plain one, which was that her body had consumed itself in service of a task and was now presenting the bill. She sat on the exam table and listened to the list and felt for the first time how heavy all of it was. Not because he was telling her, because he was naming things she had been carrying without the luxury of naming them, and being named, they became real in a different way. "How are you functioning?" he asked, not accusatory, genuinely curious. The curiosity of someone who studies the human body and has just encountered a data point that challenges his understanding of its limits. "I had a job," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something on the tablet and said, "We're going to fix all of this, starting now." She let them fix it. She sat still for the IV fluids and the wound closure and the antibiotics and all the rest of it, and while they worked, she kept her hand on Titan, who had been allowed to stay. Someone had made that decision quietly without being asked, which she filed away as a kindness she was going to remember. And she let her mind go to a place it hadn't been allowed to go for 3 days. She thought about Torres. His face. The way he'd moved during the equipment check on the morning of the mission, efficient, a little quiet, the focus of someone who takes their work seriously. She hadn't known him long. He'd been attached last minute. She had exchanged maybe 40 words with him before insertion, but she had held his hand in the last minutes of his life and said his name so he wouldn't be alone, and that made him hers in the specific way that the people you cannot save always belong to you afterward. She was going to carry that. She knew that. She had made her peace with knowing it in the same way she had made her peace with every other thing she'd had to accept in those 72 hours. Carrying it was not the same as being broken by it. She was not broken, but she was going to carry it. When the doctor finished and left her alone for a moment, she put her face in her hands. Not to cry, though some of that came anyway quietly without drama. Mostly just to be still. To be a person who was allowed to be still for the first time in 3 days without that stillness, meaning danger. Titan put his head in her lap. She kept her face in her hands a moment longer. Then she lifted it, took a breath, looked at her dog. "Okay," she said. "Okay." The first twist of the morning after came from a direction she hadn't expected. 40 minutes after she had been cleared by the medical team and settled in a recovery room, not a bed, she refused the bed. She was in a chair with Titan on the floor beside her. The door opened and Ryan Walker's wife walked in. Diane Hale was not who Ava had imagined from the stories. She was smaller, quieter in her presence. She had driven 4 hours through the night after the notification call reached her, and she had arrived with her hair still pulled back from sleep and her eyes carrying the specific quality of someone who has been running on relief and terror simultaneously for the past 12 hours. She stood in the doorway and looked at Ava. Ava started to stand. Diane crossed the room in 3 steps and wrapped both arms around her hard the way a person holds on to something they almost lost. Ava went still. She had not been held by anyone in 3 days. She had been the one holding, the one stabilizing, the one keeping everything together by the sheer force of her refusal to let it fall apart. Being held was different. She let it be different. She put one arm around Diane and held on back and did not say anything because there was nothing adequate to say. Diane pulled back after a moment. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "He told me what you did," she said. "On the phone before they took him into surgery, he told me." "He would have done the same," Ava said. "He said you would say that." A beat. "He also said to tell you the rice will be ready the day he gets out of hospital." Diane's voice broke on the last word and came back. "He made me promise to tell you specifically." Something moved through Ava's chest that she couldn't name and didn't need to. "Tell him I'm going to hold him to it," she said. Diane nodded, squeezed her hands once, and then because she was apparently exactly the kind of woman Marcus had described unsentimental, except when she wasn't, she straightened and said, "Is there anything you need? Anyone I can call for you?" Ava thought about it. "I'm okay," she said. Diane looked at her in a way that said she understood that okay was a complicated word and wasn't going to argue with it right now. "Then rest," she said simply and left. Ava sat back in her chair. Titan put his head on her knee. She rested. The investigation moved faster than these things usually move, and the reason it moved faster was General Hartwell, who was Ava learned in the days that followed the kind of general who had gotten to his rank by understanding that the truth is always easier to build on than the alternative, and who applied that understanding with a consistency that made him genuinely unusual in the environments he operated in. The communication logs were pulled within 4 hours of her return. They were exactly what she had known they would be. 17 transmissions, 17 acknowledgments, 0 extraction orders issued in response. The acknowledgments had been logged by a communications officer working under Captain Graves's direct oversight. That officer, when interviewed, told the truth. He had been told to acknowledge and hold. He had followed orders because he was 22 years old and had not yet developed the specific kind of courage required to not follow orders that feel wrong. He told the truth now. That counted for something even if it didn't undo what had followed. The recordings Ava had made during her time in the field and audio captured on a backup device she carried in her kit, a practice she had developed on her own initiative 18 months earlier, after a different situation in a different location, had made her understand the value of documentation. Those recordings confirmed the radio traffic she had heard, the coordinates, the timeline, the operational details of the planned attack. When that intelligence was cross-referenced with what Fareed provided in his briefing, which lasted 9 hours and involved people flown in specifically to receive it, the picture that emerged was large and detailed and deeply uncomfortable for a significant number of people above Captain Graves's rank. Because Graves had not acted alone. Ava had suspected that. Fareed had confirmed it. The investigation established it. The insider network that had been feeding operational information had not been operating for months. It had been operating for 2 years. The ambush that killed Torres and wounded her team was one event in a longer pattern, a pattern of leaked intelligence that had resulted in compromised operations, increased casualties, and a systemic vulnerability that nobody had been looking for because nobody had survived an event clean enough to document it and bring the documentation home. Until now. Until a 23-year-old combat medic had refused to die and had carried the proof out of the mountains on her back. When General Hartwell briefed her on the scope of what the investigation was finding, he did it in person, no intermediary. He sat across from her in a small room and told her the truth of it clearly and completely, which she understood was not something generals typically did, and which she received as the respect it was. "The attack that was planned," he said, "the one you heard the timeline for, we were able to preempt it." She had known that was coming. She had still needed to hear it said. "Torres," she said. Hartwell looked at her steadily. "Petty Officer First Class James Torres will be recognized appropriately. His family has been notified. What happened to him was not an accident, and it was not a random loss. It is part of a documented pattern that is now the subject of a formal investigation at levels that go above my authority to specify." He paused. "He is not forgotten. I want you to know that." She nodded. It didn't fix anything. It wasn't supposed to, but it was true, and true mattered. "And Graves," she asked, "under formal investigation, relieved of command, the process will take time, but the outcome," Hartwell's voice carried something she identified as a very contained form of certainty, "will be proportional to what the evidence establishes." She held his gaze. "The evidence is significant, sir." "I'm aware," he said. The days that followed had a quality she hadn't anticipated. She had expected relief. She had expected exhaustion. She had expected the specific emotional aftermath of a period of sustained crisis, the crash, the flatness, the difficulty of calibrating to a world where the threat level was no longer what her body was still treating it as. What she hadn't expected was the visits. They came one at a time mostly. Soldiers she didn't know or knew only by sight, who knocked on the door of her recovery room or found her in the corridor or caught her in the mess hall and said things to her with the slightly awkward sincerity of people who are not practiced at saying the kinds of things they want to say. A sergeant from the motor pool who had been at the informal memorial and who now stood in front of her with his hands in his pockets and said, "I just wanted to say I was wrong about what I assumed. I'm sorry we stopped looking." A communications specialist, young female who had tears in her eyes before she even started speaking, and who said, "I want to be like you when I grow up," and then looked mortified by having said it. And Ava had told her, "You already have everything you need. Trust that." An older warrant officer who didn't say anything at all just shook her hand firmly with both of his, held it for a moment, nodded, and walked away. That one stayed with her longest somehow. The moment that broke open something she had been keeping carefully sealed came on the fourth day when she was cleared for limited movement and went to find Ryan Walker in his recovery room for the first time since they had been brought in. He was awake. He looked terrible and significantly better than he had on the litter, which was a combination she recognized as genuine progress. Both legs were immobilized and elevated. He had an IV and a monitor, and the specific expression of a man who is deeply bored but too tired to do anything about it. When she came in, he looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. She sat in the chair beside his bed. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said, a silence that was not uncomfortable. "How are the legs?" she asked. "They're going to be legs again, apparently. Takes time." "How much time?" "Too much." He shifted slightly, winced. The surgeon said probably 8 months before I'm fully functional. Said it like he was proud of the number. I wanted to tell him that 8 months sounded like a long time to a man who spent 3 days being dragged through Afghan mountains by a medic half his size. She laughed quietly. He looked at her. "How are you?" "7 things wrong, all being fixed." 7. He said it with the specific tone of a man doing a calculation. "The doctors told me 2 things wrong with me, and I thought that was a lot." "You had someone taking care of you," she said. He held her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "I did." The silence again, different this time, carrying more weight. "Carter," he said, "I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you tell me I don't have to say it." She waited. "What you did it wasn't just courage. It wasn't just training. I've worked with a lot of medics. I've worked with people who were brave and skilled and dedicated and all the rest of it." He paused, chose his words the way she had come to understand he always chose things deliberately with weight behind each choice. "What you did was something different. You decided we were going to live, and you made that decision stick through things that should have been able to unmake it. And I don't have the right word for what that is, but I know what it is when I see it and I saw it, and I want to say that in plain language, so you know I know." She held what he had said inside the space of several seconds. Let it be real. "Thank you, Ryan," she said. "You're welcome." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Also, Diane says I have to invite you to Sunday dinner when I'm out of here, and she means it as a command, not a request. Red beans and rice. Obviously." "I'll be there," she said. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived on the 6th day. Ava was walking Titan through the quieter section of the base in the early morning. Titan needed to work, needed movement and purpose. The contained energy of a working dog doesn't discharge on its own, and she knew better than to let it build when a message came through on her personal device from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't open it. She opened it. It was from Fareed. He had been moved. She had known that much, that he was being relocated somewhere safer, that the process of what his cooperation meant for his future was being managed by people with the authority to manage it. She had not known where he would land or when she would hear from him. The message was short, 7 sentences. He told her that he was safe, that his information had been verified and was being acted on, that 3 of the individuals he had named were in custody, and that he had thought before he sent this message about what she had said to him in the dark, the specific things she had said when he had hesitated at the helicopter. She had said, "I give you my word," and he wrote, "I have not been given many words worth keeping. Yours was worth keeping. Thank you." She stood still in the early morning and read the message twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and looked at Titan. He was looking up at her with those amber eyes, patient, present, steady in a way that she had come to regard as one of the fixed points of her existence. "Good boy," she said, and she meant it to cover everything. The 3 days, the mountains, the patience, the dark, the enemy position, the hours on the litter, the seep of water he had found when they needed it most every step of every mile. His tail moved. Slowly, deliberately, she started walking again. The ceremony happened 6 weeks later. She had not asked for it. She had not known it was coming until 4 days before it occurred, when General Hartwell had told her personally, and she had stood in front of him and processed the information with an expression that he had apparently found amusing because one corner of his mouth had moved in a way that was unusual for a brigadier general. "Is there a problem, Sergeant?" he had asked. "No, sir," she had said. I was doing my job." "Yes," he said, "you were, and we are going to make sure that is on the record permanently in a way that is commensurate with how well you did it." She had stood in front of hundreds of service members on a morning that was clear and cold and entirely indifferent to its own significance. Titan was beside her, steady as always. His working vest on his head, up his amber eyes doing what they always did, reading the environment, processing information, finding her face periodically to check in. General Hartwell stood at the podium and said things she was going to have to read later because she was not fully absorbing them in real time, because the part of her that absorbed things was occupied with something else, with the three men standing to her left. Ryan Walker was standing, both legs 8 weeks ahead of medical projection. He was using a cane and he was standing, and the expression on his face when she had seen him before the ceremony was one that she had no adequate word for, except that it was the opposite of the face he had made in the crevice when she told him they were walking out. Marcus Hale was beside him. He had a new scar on his chest that his wife had apparently told him made him look distinguished, which was the story he was telling anyone who asked, and which he clearly believed. His color was right. His breathing was right. He had sent her a photograph 2 weeks after returning home, him and Diane at the kitchen table, 2 bowls of red beans and rice, the text saying simply saved you a seat. Daniel Brooks was on the end, standing straight as always. His shoulder had healed cleanly. The fever that had climbed through those mountain nights had long since broken and left no trace. He had told her in the quiet conversation they'd had before the ceremony that Sadie had done a school presentation about her father's deployment, that Sadie had titled it "The People Who Bring Others Home," that Daniel had read it 3 times in private before he could read it once out loud, without his voice doing something he'd rather not discuss. Ava had listened to that and had made a decision in that moment that Sadie Brooks was going to hear the real version of this story someday. The full version. Not the one that got cleaned up for ceremonies and official records. The one about the cold and the dark and the radio that no one answered, and the dog who found water, and the woman who decided that dying was not an option she was willing to entertain. That version. The true one, because that was the version worth knowing. When General Hartwell finished and the moment came and the medal was placed and the citation was read, and hundreds of people rose to their feet in the kind of response that doesn't get organized or planned, but simply happens when a room full of human beings recognizes something true. Ava Carter stood straight and looked out at the crowd and felt something she had not felt since before the mission. She felt finished, completed, not in the sense of ended, but in the sense of a thing that has been taken to its conclusion and arrived there intact. She had carried those men into hell, and she had carried them back out, and she was standing here, and they were standing there, and every step between those two facts had been paid for in full. Someone in the crowd called Titan's name. He looked up, alert ears forward. She looked down at him. "Good boy," she said quietly, for the 1,000th time, meaning it each time. His tail moved, once, certain. When she was asked by the journalist who had been given access for the record by the official, who needed the quote for the citation by General Hartwell himself in the private moment before the ceremony, when she was asked how she had survived the impossible and brought 3 men through it, she had given the same answer each time, without hesitation, without modification, because it was the only answer that was true. "Those men were my responsibility," she said. "As long as they were breathing, I wasn't leaving." There is a kind of courage that announces itself. It comes with noise and spectacle and the awareness of being watched. It knows it is brave, and it performs its bravery accordingly. History records a great deal of this kind of courage because it happens in places where people are recording things. And then there is the other kind, the kind that happens in a crevice at 3 in the morning, in the mountains of a country most people will never visit. The kind that happens when no one is watching and no one is coming, and the only reason to keep going is the fundamental refusal to be the person who stops. The kind that doesn't perform itself because there is no audience. Only the work, only the need, only the next step, and the step after that, and the step after that, repeated until the mountains run out. Ava Carter was that second kind. She had been that kind every hour of those 72 hours, not because she had decided in advance to be heroic, but because heroism, when it is real, is not a decision about yourself. It is a decision about the people beside you. It is looking at three men who are breathing and saying that is enough. That is the reason. That is all the reason there is. She had made that decision in the dark without anyone watching, and it had brought them all home. Every one of them, alive, standing, because she had refused with her whole body, her whole mind, her whole irreducible self to let it end any other way.